The role of an HR business partner is fundamentally a consulting role. And if you haven't looked at the modules on HR strategy and learning strategy, then it might be worth looking at those to see where this role is positioned on the maturity scale that I use. It's normally positioned at round about stage 4. And to be at stage 4, it needs to be an accepted role. The business needs to accept that there is somebody there who works as a partner who is going to give advice directly to line managers or to the organisation generally about how to get the best out of people. It's an unusual role in that it isn't operational, but it's very, very close to the operations side of the organisation. And many organisations have still got to grow up, if you like, and accept that there is a need for this role. So the HR business partner often has to earn the role, even though nominally they already have that title. The best way to view this is to think of how a doctor, a general practitioner, operates. They meet all sorts of patients and they have a range of illnesses and problems. And this is what an HR business partner is going to experience as well. And really what a general practitioner does, a medical practitioner, is use their diagnostic skills to work out what the problems are for each of those individual patients. And that's exactly what an HR business partner and learning consultant needs to do. So really the role is all about diagnosis, and you can only do an effective diagnosis if you base it on good evidence. So it's evidence-based practice. So let's start to look at really what this role entails. This is the business partnering and consulting module. Any HR or learning professional really has to do their work in a consulting capacity, although the term business partner is quite common and quite popular these days. So we need to look at what this consulting or partnering role really is all about. So in this module we're going to look at the temptation for consultants to actually offer what we call magic pills, and then we'll move on to look at really what they should be doing, which was focusing on the bottom line of the organisation, the outputs that the organisation needs to deliver. We'll look at this within a framework of various aspects of HR strategy: the line manager's role, the personnel or HR administration role, and then the tactical human resource management role. All of this itself has to work within an overarching strategic framework, which we will look at, and we will show how to link this strategic framework to a day-to-day operation of a business partner or consultant. One thing we can say for certain is all business partners and consultants need to fully understand the problem-solving discipline, which is covered in the professional toolkit. And key to their role is asking critical questions, and we'll look at what sort of critical questions they need to ask. Before we look at this role of consultant and business partner, let us get one thing absolutely clear. A true HR or learning professional will not be pushing magic pills. So what are these magic pills? They are pills or solutions offered to organisations without any diagnosis whatsoever of what the problem is. They're already sitting on a shelf ready to be used. There is nothing wrong with things like competence frameworks or 360 feedback systems, except when they're used in organisations without any diagnosis first. So we should not blame the pills themselves, but how they are used. Antidepressants can help people with depression, but they'll do nothing for people who don't need antidepressants. A consultant will always know the difference between offering pre-prepared solutions and ones that are based on a professional diagnosis. So, you know what a magic pill is, and in reality there shouldn't be any magic pills. There aren't any magic pills. There are no magic pills that will instantly provide an answer to the sort of organisational issues that we face. And yet organisations keep asking for them. Why is that? It's because the real solution to the people problems take a lot of time and take a lot of planning. It actually requires senior management to take a real interest in the subject. It's a lot easier for a manager who's got all sorts of problems in their team to say, let's send them on a course, Let's send them on a program. Let's pay them more. Let's come up with an instant solution to what we all know are very intractable human problems. So, if you want to be a consummate professional consultant and you want to wean yourself off offering any form of off-the-shelf solution, let us start looking at exactly what this role entails. Let's start to define and shape this role for you. Although many people talk about HR becoming a business partner, often the role of HR in organisations does not legitimise that role. So what we need to do is define what HR is really all about, what I would call a bottom line HR role or a bottom line HR function. And the bottom line HR function role is to analyse, identify and make explicit the connections between the organisation's strategic and operational objectives and its human resources. What is the connection between the people and how the organisation performs? And where necessary, it needs to transform that human resource capability to meet those challenges. And it will do so by redefining performance standards and offering methods for improving performance to maximise each individual's contribution to organisational goals by helping them to fully realise their added value potential. This is, if you like, the justification for HR as a real business partner. It is going to make a significant difference to the business and also to the individuals working in the business. This is meant to be a win-win for everybody concerned. So this role of bottom line focus that an HR business partner has to take up is almost the equivalent to an operational role, because it is so closely integrated, so closely linked to how the organisation performs, that it's almost like a surrogate manager's job, except that you can't step into a manager's shoes, an operational manager's shoes. They still have to manage their people, however well or badly they do it, and whatever help you give them, at the end of the day, they are the ones that team report to and expect to be managed and led by their manager. So an HR business partner does not take away anything from the manager's role, but only complements it, supplements it with good ideas and with ways of getting the best out of people that maybe the line manager has never thought of. One thing we can say with absolute certainty is that the role of an HR business partner is not a support role in that sense, and it's certainly not a servant to the line. It's an equal relationship. It has to be an equal relationship. It has to be equally valued by line managers. They can't treat business partners as a junior partner, because a true business partner, a consummate professional, has expertise that is really valued. And now we need to move this up another gear, because the HR business partner role, the consulting role, is actually inherently a strategic role. What we're going to do is look at the role of the HR business partner as just one role amongst several that get involved in managing people in your organisation. In fact, let's start by just asking that simple question. Who is actually managing the people in your organisation? Who is responsible for that? Obviously, one answer to that question would be, well, it has to be the line managers themselves, the first line supervisors. They're the ones who have to get tasks completed and achieve their operational and performance measures through the people that they directly meet every day and manage every day. Now, perhaps 50 or 100 years ago, that would be it. They would be the people who are managing employees on a daily basis. But these days, the relationship is a lot more complex. For a start, we need to have a professional personnel administration function that makes sure that the contractual relationship between the individual and the organisation is legally correct, but also works for the interests of the organisation and for the individual. Otherwise, why would they be motivated to give their best? So already we have two dimensions to this relationship, and the line managers would expect any contractual advice to come from the personnel administration function. So these two roles overlap. And then when the employment relationship breaks down for any reason, or if there's any change in the relationship, then the line managers will need more advice and guidance, and they tend to get this from human resource advisors or human resource managers. And we could regard this as a tactical relationship. In other words, on a daily basis, if a manager has a problem or needs advice on any issue to do with their people in their team, then they can call on somebody who has the title of HR manager. And this works reasonably well on a day-to-day basis. But there are some much bigger issues that are outside of the control of all of these three sets of people in this organisation. What we need is an overarching HR business strategy. The sorts of issues that this would need to look at are things like union relations or employee relations. What policy does the organisation want to have on this? It's obviously got to manage its people and its talent on a longer term, broader basis. It needs to move people around, so it has a talent management strategy. It has a reward strategy. So again, an individual manager will not be able to decide for themselves how much they pay their people. It will have to be within guidelines and policies set at a strategic level and put into practice both by the administration team and the advice, if you like, of the human resource management function. So these are the dimensions of people management in most organisations. Whether you like it or not, these roles really have to exist these days because of the complexities of the relationship and the legal rights, if you like, of individual employees, which have grown over the years. And this is the role that the HR business partner has to play. They have to pull together all dimensions of the employment relationship. It's a highly skilled job, and it's only the HR business partners who's got the responsibility to make sure that HR strategy is really delivering what the strategic objectives of the organisation require. And there's a great demand for HR business partners because in a complex world, the need for this role is becoming much, much more important. It might not be obvious from the slide you've just seen exactly what this means in practice, but let's look at a couple of specific areas to see if we can bring out the real practical application of this. If you put yourself in the shoes of the line manager, the first line manager, and ask yourselves what things can they not control themselves? Well, one of the things at the top of that list is the organisation's decision as to whether it wants unions or not. If a line manager is in a situation where they're facing union representatives and unionisation, they have to deal with it, they have to cope with that. The organisation could take a much bigger strategic decision that says this is not in our long-term interest to have a workforce that doesn't trust its management, that's why they want to be in a union. But that line manager is not going to change that. Whatever trusting relationship that line manager has with their team, it won't change the culture of the organisation. It might manage it at a micro level, but it won't change the policy on unionisation. Let's also look at rewards. You know, what leeway, what freedom does a line manager have to really shape the right sort of reward package for the people in their team? Because they have a range of performances, and often their hands are tied by grading, job evaluation, caps on spending and that sort of thing. So often they have to manage with their hands tied behind their back. Now again, those managers might say, I would love to have the freedom to manage my budget properly and to even increase my budget to reward people better if I thought they were really earning it. But that is within the confines of an overarching strategy for the organisation that says we need to control costs and we need to control wages and salaries as a result of that. So these things really constrain line managers, and what the HR business partner consultant brings to the piece is constantly feeding back those views to a strategic level to say, shouldn't we free up our reward system? Shouldn't we have a fresh view of whether we really want to encourage people to join a union, when in fact what we want to encourage them is to trust us as an organisation and trust our management ability. Now, a traditional HR manager can take views like this and inject them into discussions with line managers, but an HR manager is not going to influence the strategic thinking in the organisation. So an HR business partner has to be thinking strategically and has to be able to persuade and influence at a strategic level. Now, the best way to start influence at a strategic level is to have your own strategic framework to work to be able to put it in front of senior managers and say, these are all the component parts of the strategic management of an organisation, and these are the areas that have the biggest people implications, and this is where we need to help. So let's take a look now at the complete strategic planning framework that should work for any HR business partner or consultant in any organisational context. Apart from establishing a clear role for an HR business partner or a learning consultant, more important, of course, is what they actually do in practice. So what we're going to cover here is a very, very strong, robust framework that will guide everything that an HR business partner or consultant does. Now let us use an example as we go through of Richard Branson's Virgin organisation deciding that it wants to go into space and take tourists on trips into space. So Richard Branson and the leaders of the organisation need to have a vision. What does the future look like? Well, we think people will want to travel into space as tourists. They then have a mission. What do we value? Well, we value taking people on a 2 or 3 hour flight into space, and we think they'll be paying for this and they'll be able to afford to pay for it, and we think it's valuable to society to be able to offer this, to have this aspiration to travel in space. So in the vision and the mission statements or the value statements, the values of the organisation are normally embedded. Then they have to put a strategy together. How will we actually create this value? How will we put people into space? We will need to fund it, we will need to market it, we will need to create the technology to actually take us there. Once the business strategy is in place, they need an actual business plan. So how soon do we need to go in space? How much is it going to cost? How many people are we going to take up into space? This is where the numbers really start to mean something. And once the operation is in place, somebody has to manage this year's numbers. So are we getting enough tourists who want to go into space? Are the costs of taking them there under control? Now, there is nothing new in this framework. This is a standard strategic planning framework. But what we need to do now is overlay the implications for HR, for people management in the organisation. And the first way to do that is to superimpose decisions about organisation design. So if we look on the right, it's asked the question, what sort of organisation structure will we need to run this operation? What sort of processes on the left do we need to have to put people into space? And what roles do they determine? So if in the structure we have somebody who's going to be in control of flights, what process do they work to actually put people into space? And what other roles do we have to actually man the aircraft, to get people on board, to serve them on board, etc. I call this the golden triangle of organisation design, because each corner of this triangle is interdependent on the other corners. Any change in the organisation structure is likely to have an impact on processes, and any change in processes is likely to change people's roles. Now, the other aspect that we need to overlay are the systems in the organisation. What system do we have in place to make sure these flights are going to get into space and get back again safely? And the culture of the organisation. How much risk are we prepared to take? And how much is this entertainment? We want to entertain people. These are the sort of questions that will fundamentally influence really what the organisation is all about. And an HR business partner and learning consultant not only need to understand the interrelationships between all these aspects of strategic planning, but they need to know how to look into each of these areas and help the organisation decide what the implications are for people management and how best to manage people within this organisation. Now, the diagram you've just seen is quite a complex diagram. It incorporates everything we can do to help to manage organisations. And Richard Branson's Virgin organisation is just one example of how it might be applied. But let's move outside the commercial environment just for a second or two. Let's take a look at a public sector body like, say, a police force. And if we look at things like the culture of a police force, we start to see how important this stuff is. We have police officers who apparently discriminate. And you have to ask yourself the question, why do police forces continue to allow people to work there if they seem to be guilty of discrimination, whether that's against some of their own people or some of the public who they have to deal with? Well, if it's accepted, then that becomes the culture of the organisation. And if somebody's going to argue that discrimination helps an organisation to perform better, I'd be very interested to see that argument. So an HR business partner working, say, with the police force would start to look at the implications of having this sort of culture in the organisation on its ultimate purpose, its ultimate vision of trying to keep the streets safe and to reduce crime or prevent crime as much as possible. And also, the other big circle on the diagram, the system. If you ask the question, where is the system that guarantees that we're going to find the culprit, take them to court and get them convicted? We may have processes to do that. We have legal processes. The police have processes to process somebody who's been arrested. But if we look at the system and we have a culture where we have discrimination, for example, or maybe a culture where not all the police officers feel totally committed to that goal, then we should not be surprised if the systems aren't in place to make it happen. For example, part of the system would be making sure that any police officer who is gathering evidence really makes sure systematically that evidence is collected in the best way possible to support the case that eventually might go to court. This is how important these building blocks of organisations are. If you're relatively new to this sort of game, then I wouldn't expect you to become expert at organisational analysis, because that's really what this framework enables you to do. This is a highly skilled job, and it's going to take some time to really develop your skills in this area. Now, probably top of the list of the skills you're going to need is the ability to ask searching, diagnostic, critical questions of your organisation about the way it thinks about people, the way it manages people, the way it motivates people, the way it empowers people. All of these things sound very intangible, so we need a critical questioning technique to directly link these things that appear intangible to the way the organisation needs to perform. So let's build on the framework we've just looked at and add in the HR dimension and see then a complete HR business strategic framework, the complete picture. And it should also help to guide you in your day-to-day work. The business partner has a strategic business framework to work towards. What we now need to do is make this an HR framework as well. We need to integrate the way the organisation manages its people and helps them to learn within the overarching strategic business framework. Now, on the actual business framework itself, we had a vision, we had a mission, we had a strategy, and then we had a business plan and an operating plan, which contained all the measures that we need to use to gauge whether we're performing or not. Now what we need to do is link this process of planning directly to the way the organisation thinks about its people. And the way to do that is to start asking critical questions, critical people questions that the organisation needs to answer if it is to achieve its ultimate vision. Now, to do this, we have another framework bolted on, but totally integrated to the strategic business framework. There are several key steps in this HR improvement cycle, as we're calling it. The first is the critical questions have to analyse and diagnose which parts of the organisation need help and support with the way they manage people. Only when there's been a proper analysis and diagnosis can we design what we might call HR solutions. And let's not jump to any conclusions about what these HR solutions might be. We don't want any magic pills in there. There will then be a phase where the solutions have to be delivered. There has to be a conscious reinforcement of the signals and messages that we want to get across to employees. So we need to make sure somebody is responsible for reinforcing some of the strong messages that are likely to be required. If we get reinforcement, we get transfer, we get the right behaviour, we get the right attitudes in the organisation, we get the motivation, and we get the focus. And finally, we get feedback. Now, this is meant to be a cycle that feeds back on itself. So, was our original analysis and diagnosis correct or not? But it also has to feed back to the people who are actually running the organisation. So, for example, if part of the business and operating plan requires improving the management group, which might often jump to the conclusion that they need training and development, there needs to be a formal feedback to the organisation whether this management group is improving or not. And this will be one of the problems that business partners and learning consultants face, is creating a culture in the organisation that allows and actually encourages this honest and open feedback to take place. This is the complete strategic HR framework. Now, there are obviously exercises included in this module which will take you through the steps of applying the theory in practice. But before you do that, let's just look at one particular issue that really starts to apply. I used to work in the automotive industry, and one of our biggest customers used to say to us every year, we want you to reduce your prices by, say, 5%, because they were competing with some tough Japanese competition. And the management team that I was part of had to decide how we would cope with these constant requests for reducing our prices. And obviously, you start to say, well, if we have to reduce our price, we have to reduce our costs. So as a management team, we all used to take our own responsibility for trying to reduce the cost in our area. I don't remember anybody, including myself, ever saying years ago, hey, if we're going to have to reduce 5% year on year, then over, say, 5 years, that's a 25% reduction at least in the cost base of this organisation. And whilst we can get our heads around the idea of a 5% reduction, if you start to say, well, what does a 25% reduction look like? Then it forces you to think outside of the box. It forces you to think of a very different organisation, a much leaner organisation. And there are huge HR implications that sit behind that. So I remember the production director constantly putting pressure on his own line managers to save cost. But actually what he should have been doing, and I should have been supporting him in doing, is talking to these managers about managing differently, about managing their people better. You cannot micromanage a 25% reduction in cost. Everybody in the organisation has to be willing to take part in that. And I think that's the key to this. That's the difference between managing at a micro level in a sort of step-by-step way and managing strategically and thinking about the strategic implications of managing people. Now, this might start to appear quite a complex, complicated task for an HR business partner, but actually all the tools in this whole Consummate Professional series are based on a very old idea, an idea that says we need to look at problems in a disciplined, systematic, structured way, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. If you haven't already done so, you should really look at the Professional Toolkit module. But here we're going to just make the point that a consultant and a business partner should always follow a very rigorous problem-solving discipline. Now, this is not a new discipline. The basic steps in this discipline have been established for many, many years, but very rarely are they applied to the people management questions in organisations. So let's just look at each of the steps in using this discipline. The first point to make is that data has to be gathered. And what we're really saying here is it will be operational data that we gather, but we will be interpreting this in terms of the people implications. First thing you need to do as an HR business partner or a learning consultant is to define and measure the problem that you're trying to solve. sending people on a leadership development course without defining what impact leadership is meant to have would be a very pointless exercise because it isn't following a problem-solving discipline. Only when you've defined and measured the problem that you're trying to solve can you actually then do your root cause analysis. And only then can you start to create solutions. If this is the correct way to do it, why do we see so many pre-prepared training and development programs on the market? To what extent have they defined the problems or analysed the root causes in a particular context before they offer the solution? Only then can you actually plan and implement the solution. And then, in theory, you have to measure and evaluate whether the problem was solved. Although if you go to the evaluation and ROI module, you will see there that measuring afterwards is not as important as measuring before. And key to the whole process is this idea of feedback and review. Whether you get it right or get it wrong, whether the problem is solved or not, the actual result has to be fed back to all the stakeholders so they can take a view on whether to continue or not. Any consultant who wants to call themselves a consummate professional should be following a rigorous problem-solving discipline. So the problem-solving discipline actually tells us there is always a sequence of steps that we have to go through. We can't just jump around. If we want to be a consummate professional, we need to know the sequence of steps that we have to follow, and that's what the discipline does for us. Now all we need to do is look at a specific set of steps to ask these critical questions in the right way, to draw out of the organisation what are the real people issues and what solutions might we come up with that could help us with these. The most important skill for a consummate business partner or learning consultant is to ask critical questions that will enable you to link HR strategy to business strategy using the framework we've looked at. You'll notice that in brackets we've got measurement, because all of these questions should be brought down to measurement questions ideally, because it is the measures that the business is already using that will point us in the right direction for the people issues. Now, before we go through the 4 steps of this critical questioning technique, just keep in the back of your mind the idea that you've gone to see your doctor. You're not quite sure what's wrong with you, but you do feel ill, and the doctor has to ask you critical questions to diagnose the causes of your problems. Only then can they reach for the prescription pad to offer a solution to your illness. Now, in a business context, what we were probably talking about is business figures. The top headline figures will be the first thing we look at because we need to do a very quick, broad analysis. We're trying to find out what are the main issues. This is a typical Pareto approach. What are the biggest things that we should focus on first? And also, what are the parameters that we have to work within? So, for example, do we have a recruitment freeze at the moment? If so, that is going to limit our options. Only when you've found out what the biggest issues are can you move on to the second phase of this critical questioning technique and do what we might call a deeper analytical diagnosis. So what exactly are the problems? So, for example, if a main issue is low revenue figures, then the diagnosis says what's causing the revenue figures to be so low and what can we do about it. Only then can we move into prescription mode and say, well, of all the possible solutions we might have, what would be the best solution? And of course, as an HR or learning professional, we are particularly majoring on the HR and learning parts of possibly a blended solution. Finally, you have to ask, did it solve the problem? We will call this the evaluation stage. Now, you might think we wait until the end to ask this question, but we don't. The critical questioning technique has to answer all of these questions before anything actually is put into place. So the evaluation question initially is, how will we know that the problem is being solved? If a business partner or a learning consultant becomes really skilled in using this diagnostic process, the probability is very high that they will be dealing with the right problems and coming up with the right solutions. So there it is. If you follow the steps in this module, it will demonstrate very clearly to anybody you're working with that you are very professional in your approach. And in fact, don't hide these tools and techniques. Don't hide the sequence of questions. I think the key here is to actually put them on the table at any management meeting you might go to and say, well, I'm following a sequence of steps. I'm following a structured, systematic approach. Has anybody got a better way of doing this? Because if you have, then let's share that as well. What you will find is any manager, if they're a professional manager, will be following the same steps. This is not some form of magic. If you think about it in a common sense, logical way, this is the only way to deal with organisational issues. And if you want to be a consummate professional, you have to become very skilled at this.